We can't tell you the results. The athlete's not eligible for the female XX category. You need to read between the lines. If they know that about themselves, they shouldn't be getting into a boxing ring with female athletes.
The feeling is that the Olympic Committee is perhaps ideologically captured, less willing to actually look at the biology here and more willing to focus on some woo-woo of passports and things.
I've seen it in the mainstream media, an endocrinologist today describing Khelif as absolutely biologically a woman. That's not lack of education. I think that's deliberate misinformation. That's an attempt to undermine the reality of sex. Even just saying words like male and female is de facto transphobic.
Who's telling you that?
People that write to my institute to ask that I be sacked. This athlete's mother reported me to the police for a hate crime incident.
Is it likely that Imane would now know, having gone through puberty, that he is a man? What is your sort of role, profession?
So I'm a developmental biologist. I'm at the University of Manchester. So that means I'm studying how bodies grow, very simply.
Okay, so you are the expert for what we're going to talk about, or one of the experts, I think. I think that's why I wanted to speak to you. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today, or mainly speaking about, is people with something called DSD, which people used to know of as intersex. There's a great book called Middlesex. Did you read that?
I haven't read it. I've read the synopsis.
It's so good. It's such a good book. And it's done nothing to do with, it doesn't matter about trans. It's just a really interesting book about somebody. It's like what do they call it? Bundesroman. Bildung. I can't remember. It's a coming of age novel. That's a better way of saying it. Really, really interesting. Imane Khelif is, well, why don't you tell me, who is Imane Khelif?
So Khelif is a boxer who has been competing in the female category at the Paris Olympics. The competition is still ongoing. And there's been some significant controversy around Khelif's eligibility to be in the female category. And typically, we're thinking about two types of athlete. I've dealt a lot with transgender women who are obviously born male and the types of male advantages they might carry through into the female category. But in this case, we're not really discussing gender identity or transgender athletes. In this case, it's more a case of a DSD, a difference of sex development. And these are very typically what would be described as edge cases when you're trying to sort athletes into a fair category, that is either the male or the female category. These athletes can be quite tricky to organise. We have to understand quite a lot about the biology of particular conditions and how that might link to male advantage, or in fact, if it doesn't link to male advantage at all.
This is more complicated than I think a lot of people would like it to be. Is the suggestion, and I don't think it is, but is the suggestion that sex is on some sort of spectrum?
I don't think that's the right framework to take away from people with DSDs. When we think about male and female development, we have some very well-established developmental pathways that start at fertilization, depending on which sex chromosomes you inherit from dad, in the case of mammalian species. And this different genetic information triggers a male developmental pathway or a female developmental pathway. And nobody ever says that developmental biology is perfect. There's lots of genes and signaling and tissues moving around and all that kind of thing. Things can go wrong. Things regarding sex development, reproductive anatomy and that kind of thing, they can start to look sometimes, rarely, but sometimes atypical for what we think about the male suite of anatomy and the female suite of anatomy. So we do have people that kind of branch away from what would be their healthy development. And in that case where we have these DSDs in sport, that really starts to make us think a little bit harder than the typical female XX, male XY division that we've kind of historically, cleaved along.
Can you then get a man, so somebody, if we're defining man with gametes or chromosomes, who has, say, a womb or a vagina? So
you can have male DSDs. So these are DSDs that would affect a baby that would normally be a healthy male and would be born observably male. You can have DSDs that cause a slight branching. For example, the main one that we're probably going to think about with these boxes, and maybe we'll talk about here, is a DSD called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. So that's basically when baby, who is developing quite happily as a male baby, has an enzyme deficiency. So they're missing a protein that's needed for that baby's body to grow a penis. Okay, so everything has been developing as male, very typically. But when it comes to that final stage, developing your external genitalia is very late on in sex development. When it comes to that final stage, there's something missing. And it means that the male external genitalia doesn't grow properly. And in that case, babies can start to look, you know, when they're born, and midwife or doctor or, you know, mother looks at a baby and says, it's a girl. That might not necessarily reflect what's happening internally.
When there's a fetus, how do they, oh, it's a boy, it's a girl, and it's very exciting. How do they tell when it's in the womb?
So it used to be, and still mostly is, by ultrasound. And what you're looking there for is the presence of a penis or the absence of a penis. So when you make a call and say, well, I can see, you know, by this visual kind of, you know, X-ray specs, if you like, we can see that, well, baby's got a penis. That probably means almost certainly that they're male, and that's congruent, you know, that's typical of what else is happening internally. And then if you don't see that marker, you'll make a call that the baby is likely to be female.
Okay, so yeah, in the womb as well. And then you said that they grow quite late, the external genitalia.
Yes, relatively late.
So they wouldn't, so you can't, because I've never had kids, I don't know how quickly they sort of tell you if it's a girl or boy.
So if you're using an ultrasound, it can be quite late. So 18 weeks, something like this. However, we're increasingly moving now, and that's to do with perhaps also the demographics of maternal age and how that's shifting. We're increasingly moving to molecular testing. So you can take a blood sample from mum, and within that blood sample, you can detect fetal DNA.
Wow.
And you can analyze fetal chromosomes from that DNA. So increasingly at 10 or 12 weeks, we can take a maternal blood sample and understand the sex of the baby. Now, we know mum is going to be XX, short of a medical condition. So if we start detecting a Y, we know that baby is a male. And if we can never detect a Y in that fetal DNA, we make the assumption that baby is female.
Okay. And so with this suspected, was it 5 or 6 ARD?
5 ARD.
5 ARD. Would this person likely actually have what resembles a vagina? Is it just a penis that's sort of inside a little bit? No.
So when babies are born with this, they can have actually genitalia that can look very ambiguous. So in that case, we're talking about something called a micropenis, which is actually a medical description. So really a very small, but kind of well developed in terms of structure penis, or we can have something that looks more towards like female anatomy. So that would be when all that tissue is folding, instead of making a penis, it folds in different ways. It starts developing slightly different, just in terms of the external genitalia. So that would mean that sometimes you do have babies that look really very typically female, but that's quite unpredictable.
Okay. And they wouldn't have a uterus and things like that?
No. So everything, if we start at the start of the developmental sequence, we have the inheritance of XY chromosomes, so the inheritance of Y from dad, from the sperm. And then that genetic information is used. The first step is to take two little balls of tissue. No pun intended, 2 balls of tissue that are either going to be made, told, instructed to turn into testes or to turn into ovaries. So that's the first step. After those structures, either testes or ovaries are made, they start making different hormone environments. And it's those different hormone environments that direct anatomy development downstream of those. So for boys, for males, that would mean you don't make a uterus. In fact, you get rid of any structure in your body that is the precursor of a uterus. And instead, you promote the development of all the internal plumbing that boys have that girls don't have.
I see. And so this is where it gets into controversial territory, because we've got a world right now who seem to be completely divided. And on both sides, you've just got people screaming at each other saying, well, Imane Khelif, well, it doesn't matter because that's a girl, she's a girl, and that was it, and it doesn't matter. And then other people going, what do you mean that's just a guy? And all I've seen is there were sort of one or two tests from, is it the IBA?
IBA, yeah.
The IBA. And other people are disputing this. So where are we with him?
Yeah, so what we know from the IBA is, first of all, maybe we should go back a little bit and think about the IOC here. So
that's the Olympic Committee.
The International Olympic Committee. Now, usually in an Olympic competition, the particular sports are managed and regulated by their international federations. So in this case, the track and field that we're seeing at the moment, that's all regulated by World Athletics. When it's come to boxing, the International Olympic Committee has disaffiliated the IBA, who would normally be managing these events. And they've done that for assertions of lack of financial transparency, the kind of standard corruption charges that some sports federations accrue from time to time. So what the IOC have said is that you're not managing boxing at the Olympics. And actually, this was the case in 2020, which we still call it, even though it happened in 2021. It was the case in Tokyo and is the case now in Paris. The IOC said, you're not running it, you're corrupt, we're going to manage it. And so what we've now got is a tension between two sports bodies with different rules on eligibility for the female category. So the IBA, the International Boxing Association, says that their categories are based on chromosomes. The male category is XY, the female category is XX, and that they've tested these athletes. There was a press conference just today where they said, we can't tell you the results. There are privacy and medical confidentiality issues there. We can't tell you the results. The athlete's not eligible for the female XX category. You need to read between the lines. So that's very directly, albeit in a slightly roundabout way, saying that these athletes are XY. Now, what the IOC's position seems to be is that they don't support the concept of sex testing at all. So they're not dealing with the results that the IBA say they've given to the IOC. What they're saying is, you shouldn't have tested them.
Wow.
So they're refusing to acknowledge that the testing process is valid, let alone what the results of that testing process are. Their eligibility for boxing is based on legal documents. And they've mentioned what it's on your passport. And what we know, and I'm not remotely suggesting that's happened actually with these athletes, but what we know is that many countries now, when they're trying to deal with, cohorts of people who have gender identities that maybe they're saying don't match their sex, and they're allowing people to change their legal documents. So a passport really isn't a reliable indicator of what your sex at birth was. It may be, in this case, these athletes may have been observed as female at birth. But it's certainly not what's important in sport, which is all of that internal hormones and testes or ovaries that are really driving your physical development, at key times of your life, like puberty.
And that's why this is, although it's not a trans issue, in a very roundabout way, it sort of is, because the feeling among a lot of gender critical people, I suppose, is that the Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, is perhaps ideologically captured and therefore less willing to actually look at the biology here and more willing to focus on some woo-woo of passports and things.
Yeah, and I've been very critical of the IOC, and I remain very critical of the IOC. Me and 25 other academics published a paper this year talking about the IOC's kind of vision, if you like, their framework for how sports should think about these questions. And that was a framework that very definitely said, we're talking about transgender athletes and we're talking about athletes with differences of sex development. So they're two separate cohorts, but they are kind of co-regulated together. And according to the IOC, that should be based on their gender identity. It should account for, in the case of certainly the transgender community of athletes, but perhaps some of these athletes with DSDs who are modulating their hormones, how that changes how we think about their categorization. That's the IOC position. It's very much a rights framework. Our paper was very strongly of the opinion that they are ignoring an evidence base, and that they are, that their framework just really isn't scientific. I'm not clear that they want to have a scientific framework. They want to be rights-led. They want non-discrimination based on gender identity. That's something separate from my point of view. We're talking about sports. We're talking about bodies. It doesn't matter what someone's gender identity is. It doesn't matter what political party they vote for. It doesn't matter what religion they are. In fact, sport is something that's always been pitched as bringing together this, amazing diversity of people, and starting to ignore those, geopolitical boundaries that have, separate us in our non-sports life. So it's quite interesting to see this clash of what the IBA and in fact what a lot of other sports federations are doing, which is we need to think about biology here, and the IOC saying you need to think about gender non-discrimination.
That's why to an extent it is a trans issue, or an issue around this ideology, and really frustrating, and can lead to women getting punched in the face by men, which most people hopefully don't want to see. Are there then, with that, if that's their stipulation at the IOC, are there trans athletes at the moment? I don't know of any. Could Leah Thomas be swimming this year?
No. So we don't know of any. We know that there are some female-born people, I will call them females, who have a non-binary identity. So they're saying they're not actually female, but nor are they male.
Just want attention.
It's a kind of special identity that actually isn't really accounted for in any sporting regulation, although people are trying. But so we have some females who say they're non-binary, or who in fact say they're trans men.
Okay.
Who are competing within the female category. And that's okay as long as they're not taking testosterone, which would be a doping violation, right? We don't allow people to supplement testosterone. So there are trans athletes. There aren't, to my knowledge, any males who say they're women competing in the female category. And that, to some extent, has been down to athletes like Leah Thomas and Emily Bridges in cycling. So these major Olympic sports, track and field, cycling and swimming, have had these very highlight cases over the last couple of years, the last 3 years or so. And they've been forced, their hand has been forced to regulate for this, because it's quite clear that the scientific consensus is for males who say they're women, and even when they take hormone treatments to suppress testosterone, they don't lose their male physicality, okay? They've acquired male height, they've acquired broad shoulders and narrow hips, bigger muscles, all those kinds of things that we know, frankly, make men better at sport. Mm-hmm. They can't erase that history of their male development. And so there are serious issues about fairness here. And what it's taken is athletes thrust into the limelight. And that's what's happening now, albeit for athletes who, by my rationale, are male, but aren't trans. They're male with a DSD. Mm-hmm. And we still have to think about the same things. And we're still dealing, for years we've been saying this, you need to start regulating for this before those athletes are on the front page of a newspaper, or before they're thrown into the pit of social media. Because what is going to happen, and we can, speak what I think is neutrally, but realistically, not everyone is, inclined to be charitable. Yeah. Not everyone is inclined to be able to divide, what do we think about in terms of society versus what we need for sport. And it really is a failure of some federations. They're just waiting and waiting. We don't need to regulate, or we don't need to think about this. And what they're saying is we're going to wait for one of our athletes to be on that stage with all of this, spotlight on them. And that's really, really an awful situation.
It's so hard, isn't it? I think about, you were saying about the trans men appear to be competing with the women. And it just seems, sometimes I wonder, why are the trans women, why do they want to go with the women? Is it because they really feel like women? But the trans men don't seem to have a problem competing with women. So what does that say to us about trans women, so men who want to compete with the women. It just feels like a sort of South Park satire where they really want an easier ride and want to win. I don't want to just jump to that conclusion, because I know that not everybody. I mean, most people are sort of not just bad people. They think they're good and they want to win, but they feel like they really are a woman or whatever it might be. I don't want to jump to assume malice when there might be just they're not quite all there.
Yeah, and at the risk of saying not all transgender women, there have been transgender women who've stayed in the male category because they've said, I was born male, and that means something for sport. So we do see a small minority. We're not talking about a large cohort of athletes to start with, but we do see some males who want to live as women, whatever that means, and want to identify themselves to the rest of the world as women, but who in sport have a much more kind of what I would say sensible understanding of what that means for sport. And I think the understanding that sometimes is missing as well is sport is something that most of us do socially. So for a lot of us, it's something that we enjoy. It's recreational. We may do, low-level competitions or running around or that kind of thing. And for a lot of the population, sport is some kind of vehicle for social purposes, when actually, for athletes, it's not really, or it doesn't need to be anything connected to that. It's something that is important to get right in terms of the science and the biology. And obviously not all athletes are just using sport as a vehicle for, their identity or to feel validated in a particular identity. So
complicated.
Yeah, there's a tension between sport as a human right, which I don't think sport is a human right. And whether sport is just some kind of social good and we make some rules about it. And in this case, here are your eligibility rules. If you don't like them, you don't have to compete. For some people, that would sound like we're banning athletes. Nobody wants to ban anyone from sport. I don't think it's a human right, but I think it's a really good thing for people to do. In the same way, I think it's really good for people to listen to music or, read a good book. It's a good thing for people to do.
Yeah. Well, Imane Khelif, is it likely that Imane would now know, having gone through puberty, that he is a man?
Yes. So my understanding from the process that the IBA has been trickling out, I suppose, if you like, through a series of written statements and today a press conference, and from how that's been complemented by what the IOC are saying, is that the testing was done and that both athletes were told. And both athletes, because, there are procedures and there are rights to appeal. And so both athletes were told that they weren't eligible for the female category. Yeah. It's their medical information. I have to assume they have those results. Yeah. And they were given
Lin Ting, because we haven't mentioned, or I haven't mentioned. Yes. That's the other similar situation.
And both athletes were given the opportunity to appeal. That would be through something like the Court of Arbitration in Sport, which is the body that oversees disputes between athletes and federations. It deals with doping cases and this kind of stuff. It dealt with Caster Semenya. And again, this XYDSD called 5ARD, and trying to understand how that specific one plays out in sport. They were given these athletes, these boxers were given the opportunity to, take it a bit further, get an investigation about that. And one of them immediately refused. And that was understood to be a legally binding acceptance that the results were true. And then Khelif started the process and then withdrew. Again, understanding, I think, that would be legally binding, an understanding of what an investigation might find.
Yeah, apparently they were even offered, it was going to be free, or they were going to get given the funds to do it. I guess the only lingering doubt, and I hate saying I've got doubt, not because I think we should have doubt with everything, but just because everybody jumps on you and starts shouting at you if you show any caution or just wanting to double check things as a journalist. There is word going around that the IBA is currently Russian-backed, state-backed, and there are two issues, which is that one, Khelif had just heavily thumped a Russian athlete. Of course, we know from the past that Russia places a lot of stock in sports washing or their athletes doing really well. And we also know that Putin has used the gender situation before to sort of contrast with the terrible West and those kinds of things. And the only evidence we have, or the only people we know who are saying, hey, X, Y, is that Russian-backed company. So what do we do with that?
So I think, and I'm not an expert on those, those kind of political parts of this, the dark sporting world, beyond kind of state doping programs, from decades ago, or actually, no, that's not really the case, right? but okay, beyond state doping programs. So I'm not really familiar with that. I'm not entirely clear why perhaps a very credible claim of financial corruption and all those kinds of things means that a lab in New Delhi, an accredited lab that actually is used by the world doping, people to do their samples. I'm not clear what it means their testing process is somehow drawn into that. They seem like two very separate things. So whatever I guess I'm thinking that there may have been dubious motivations. I've got really nothing to say about why those athletes were flagged for testing. The IBA say it's because they were prompted by other international federations, presumably trying to defend their own athletes and asking for some kind of testing to be done. Whatever's happened there, what we do know is that there are these tests there that show these athletes are XY. And at this point, the IOC can say, look, this federation is so corrupt, we're just not going to listen to anything they say. But we're talking about boxing. We're not talking about a kind of rationale that says, okay, just let us get through this Olympics. They're in, let's say, running. Mm-hmm. There's not any safety concerns. There might be some carryover unfairness, but give us a chance to just get through this and then we'll deal with it. This is boxing. For me, this is, within the Olympic context, the most immediate and urgent type of concern, that there is a safety risk in boxing, that the IOC, who is in charge of that boxing competition, are almost obliged from a duty of care to act upon. I get they might not want to act upon it, but there's a really significant concern there. And instead of meeting it head on, the IOC could ask for testing. Yeah. If they don't trust what, Russian mafia, corrupt, whatever people are saying about this, I don't know. If they don't trust what the federation has done, the concern is so urgent, I think, that they're obligated to follow it up regardless.
But is there like a shred of doubt in your mind that goes, oh, you know what, they both these athletes could just be, it is possible they could just be women?
I think we would then be talking about corruption of the scientific process in an accredited lab. And I mean, I don't really have any comment on what a corrupt federation might do to produce that situation. I don't know.
Would the bodies then, through puberty, have developed in a way that changes things from, I know you were saying when they're born, you can't really tell from the genitalia. Would it be different at 15 years old?
Yeah. So when we think about, almost everyone, including the IOC, accept that there's a need for male and female categories in a lot of sports. I don't think that's particularly controversial to say. We can all intuit it just when we walk down the street or when we've run around a playground at school, right? So there is a need for male and female sport. But what the IOC don't do, and they don't do it in their publications, and they're not going through that process even now, is understanding, okay, you've created a category boundary. They don't want to face head on what that category boundary means. So lots of academics, sports federations have tried to understand, we need male and female categories. What is it about males and females that separates them into those two categories? And I've done some work on this. Like I say, sports scientists and endocrinologists have put forward, they've drawn out very clearly what they think the biological process is that underpins the divergence in sports performance between males and females. That means we need two categories. So that divergence, that kind of biological line, is if you have testes, which I would say means you're male, but if you have testes that make testosterone, which is an anabolic steroid that males have 20 times more than females, certainly at puberty, but they also experience testosterone bursts in utero, in the womb, and post-birth. So testes plus testosterone coming from those testes, plus a functional testosterone pathway. So by that I mean you've got testosterone receptors that work properly, and your body is capable of responding to that testosterone signaling in terms of triggering muscle growth, in terms of how it interacts with your height. If you fulfill all those criteria, that's the dividing line. If you're on one side of that, you're in category here, which we'll call male for convenience. And if you're on the other side of that, you may have a DSD. Okay. More routinely, you'll just be a straight up female. But you may have a DSD. But if you're on this side of the line, you can compete here, because we don't think that even with the DSD, you have male advantage. What we're talking about here are DSDs that affect only males that do carry male advantage. So these are athletes, and this includes Caster Semenya as well. These are athletes who have testes, who have testosterone, who have functional testosterone signaling going on in all their body, and who at puberty respond to testosterone like any other boy does. Okay. So they're growing their shoulders, and they're growing tall, and they're getting big hearts. And the minutiae is amazing. The way a nerve, the angle that a nerve can hit a muscle has a male female kind of distribution. So many differences actually between male and female. We broad brush them with height, muscular skeletal stuff, and then cardiovascular stuff. But all of these tiny differences between male and female bodies. And there's evidence that some of these XYDSDs are responding and growing in terms of their body like any typical male.
And so I guess what I want to ascertain then is, would these people with DSDs, would they realize by the time they're 15, like, oh, you know what, I'm not actually a girl?
Yes. So what we know about something like 5ARD, which is effectively everything is male apart from the external genitalia, what we're going to see at puberty is girls, or, certainly babies that were observed as female at birth, they're not going to have a female puberty. They aren't going to get their periods. How that's diagnosed may differ depending on, if you're captured within a kind of Western modern medicine environment versus no access to those kinds of, facilities. And a feature of 5ARD, it's quite interesting, is effectively these babies look female, but that's because they're under masculinized. They haven't had a particular type of testosterone signaling that's required to grow a penis. But at puberty, they've got so much testosterone that they tend to experience a bit of a catch-up. So actually, even at this point, their external genitals, which may look quite female, will start to masculinize because they've just got so much testosterone.
Wow.
Like pubertal boys do, right? So there are physical changes that we might typically see. And interestingly, although I don't say this with any intention of discussing it too much further, about 50% of these girls switch their gender identity at puberty and start identifying as boys.
Okay.
And in fact, in adulthood, they can father children with assistance.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. So I think, I went through puberty as a girl, albeit in a fairly, well-educated and modern environment. I think I would have noticed, but it doesn't mean that every girl has access to those kinds of, healthcare interventions that I would have been able to access. But regardless, I think masculinization of your body is something that's quite tricky to miss.
It's a difficult one. I guess it's an unknowable. It feels, I guess some of us feel angry. A lot of us feel angry at committees like the IOC, where we're annoyed that this has been allowed to happen, that men for quite some time now have been able to compete on what seems, it's purported to be a level playing field with women. We're angry at a distortion of truth as well, just besides anything else. Just come on, we can see what's in front of our eyes here. So many of us are angry, and we don't know whether to direct our anger just at the IOC, as many people are doing, but also at the two athletes at the centre of the storm themselves, who might be knowingly going in and beating up women, or maybe less plausibly, they might not realise and might go, what's going on here? But you would think they would come out and really push to have chromosomes retested and all these kinds of things, and they just haven't done it. So
yeah, I think there is probably a very human desire, and these individual athletes have been, making front pages for a week now. There's quite a natural human desire to think about, particularly if you come from a feminist background or you've worked, fighting for female sports, to think that we should target those individuals, that if they know that about themselves, that they shouldn't be getting into, in this case, a boxing ring with female athletes, given the real safety concerns when you have, when you consider the differences between how hard a male can punch. It's tricky, but the problem really lies with policy and education around that policy. So, okay, it is possible that some athletes who are XY, and I would argue Caster Semenya is one of these, who simply, and perhaps as a coping mechanism, who simply say it's just like any other advantage that all athletes have, right? All athletes have, if you believe social media, they're all superhuman, adamantium boned, So all athletes have genetic advantages or physiological advantages that arise from those genetics. And this is just another one. And so one can't argue that Caster Semenya has not been educated via 3 years of court hearings and expert testimony of people describing very clearly what this DSD that she has entails. But for some athletes, for sure, there will be a lack of education about actually what this means for their body. But really, the problem has to be with the policy that if you are going to regulate a sex-affected sport, and by that I mean one where there is a distinct performance advantage for either males or females, but quite clearly we're talking mostly about male advantage here. If you're going to regulate a sex-affected sport that operates male and female categories to account for the fact it's sex-affected, you have to understand your eligibility policy. You have to ensure your athletes understand that policy. And if that policy fails, that's on you, okay? The athletes shouldn't be in the spotlight. This should have been dealt with, I would argue for sex testing of anyone who wants to enter the female category at a young age, as soon as they show up for a competition and say, I'd like to run as a female. I'm registered with World Athletics or whichever, or Boxing Federation. Okay, the category is for females. We need to check that you're female in the same way that, they get checked for whether they're doping. You can't compete unless you're not doping. You can't compete here unless you're female. We're a sports federation. We have the right to ascertain that. These are our eligibility criteria. And sports federations really haven't developed a clear policy. And I've just seen Seb Coe. The
Olympic. What was he?
So he's head at World Athletics at the moment. And they were quite clear. They made a policy change last year where they really just drilled down into what did it mean for the female category, who would be excluded. And as it happens, they excluded transgender women, so males who believe that they're women. They excluded them if they've ever experienced significant male development, regardless of what they're doing in their adult life. So he's come out today and said sports feds need a policy. And when they've got a policy, they need to follow it up, because otherwise we just end up with this mess of the world's media, the ones that are trying to be nice, but also the ones that are trying to make their point by taking, shall we say, a stronger line. It's really tough. It's the sports feds that need to protect their athletes.
Some of the misinformation has been extraordinary, and you even see this is why I guess I was a bit concerned, and I didn't want to go rushing straight into this because I don't know anything about science. But like Snopes, I don't know if you know Snopes. They're one of the websites of they debunk conspiracy and myth and all of that, and they took the complete opposite side to what you're saying. This is a female person. But even within that, I can see, without being a scientist and without having the scientific background, I can see ideological footprints within what they wrote, because they wrote about, always has identified as a woman, and their passport is a woman, as if that has anything to do with reality and science and biology. But I mean, some of the things I've been hearing, what do they even mean? So in one of these articles, but it was written that between 5 and 10% of women have hyperandrogenism, which is a key symptom of polycystic ovarian syndrome. What does that mean?
Yeah, so polycystic ovary syndrome, so PCOS, is something that affects a lot of women. Okay, and it's basically your ovaries start to make cysts, and you can have some quite elevated testosterone in association with having that medical condition. And that elevated testosterone, we just touched on whether a woman would know that she's becoming a bit masculinized. In terms of PCOS, we're talking about maybe, a woman will experience kind of menstrual disruption and fertility issues, but also maybe, let's say, to characterize it, a slightly hairier lip or something like that, something that starts to trigger that they've got a hormonal imbalance. When we think about the actual testosterone levels of women with PCOS, they are elevated, but the normal testosterone distributions of males and females are really very separate. Okay, some people have tried to obfuscate that, including the IOC, by saying men and women overlap in terms of their testosterone distribution. But the only way, or not the only way, when you look at athlete profiles, yes, you see some athletes who are registered as male with really remarkably low testosterone within the female range. And yes, you see some athletes who are registered as female with very high testosterone within the male range. But once you control for the effects of doping on males who dope and take anabolic steroids, when they stop doing that because they're starting to come into competition season, their body has been suppressed from making natural testosterone because they've been chucking loads of it in. Okay, so there's a refractory period where they've really got quite low testosterone before their body catches up. They're not getting this outside supply anymore. I need to start making it again. Okay, once you get rid of those, you don't have males in the female range. And when you look at the other end, the females with high testosterone, they're almost exclusively males with DSDs.
Right.
So they're in the female category, but their physiology is male. So once you control for that, you get a very strong, statistically significant split between male and female testosterone. Women with PCOS are well within the female range. They're slightly towards the higher end of the female range, but they're not in the male range.
I see. Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is like it is quite an extraordinary. I mean, let me know if you're not saying this, but it is quite an extraordinary difference. It is a leap from women to men. It's because I think we're led to believe, again, I'm going back to the gender issue. I mean, that's what a lot of people watching have been interested in. That's why this is such a buzz topic, apart from the fact that this is violence of men on women, of course, as well. But there's always this impression of like, hey, they're all a spectrum and it's so close anyway. And all you do is take a few hormones and then you really are that other thing. And I guess what you're saying is that's just utterly not the case.
Yeah, and I think that that's not lack of education. I think that's deliberate misinformation. I think that's the ideology of trying to pretend in order to, validate gender identity as the primary, human characteristic by which we might divide ourselves. That's an attempt to undermine the reality of sex. And we've seen this now on social media. I've seen it in the mainstream media. An endocrinologist today describing Khelif as absolutely biologically a woman. And even when we consider what that might mean, and I've got nothing to say about Khelif's social identity or even legal identity, but it's very difficult for me to hear an endocrinologist who is thinking about things like testes and testosterone and prostates and to say that someone with those features internally is absolutely a woman. I mean, we have to admit that there's at least some ambiguity there, right? In these types of cases. But this is all feeding into that idea that there should not be sex-based protections, rights. I don't really, we can talk about maybe what some of those are. They extend beyond sport, certainly. We don't want those things to happen. So we're going to pretend that male and female don't exist. And we've seen this concerted effort for several years now in the scientific media, certainly in the scientific popular media, like Scientific American and those kinds of periodicals, to really fool everyone into what we've known. And what we know is an, evolutionary kind of natural history to our species, to all mammals, to nearly all animals, to plants, right? This is part of the very fact of life on Earth, that there are two sexes. And suddenly people are saying in this very postmodern environment, oh, actually, we're not sure there are. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. We don't have to pretend there's no difference between male and female to understand. Sometimes some people need protections. Sometimes we might be able to respect a gender identity and accommodate it in certain circumstances. We don't need to pretend very basic facts about life are in fact not very basic facts.
Do you ever feel a pressure not to say the controversial thing? Have you ever felt that pressure from outside to sort of go along with certain aspects of gender identity or any of that?
No, not at all.
Okay, you won't get in trouble or fired or anything?
Well, I mean, I've had complaints to my institute about some of the things that I've said. I've been, I'm a biologist. I'm not a humanities scholar. I'm not a gender studies scholar or anything like this. I've always been quite clear. My entire public persona is sex and sport. It's the biology of sex, and it's how that's related to sporting categories. And to some extent, I think I felt fairly confident when I started reading about this and researching about this, that not only was I quite, expert in at least one of these domains to be able to understand the science, but also as a scientist, slightly protected from all of this humanities, postmodern stuff going on over there, right? I'm a scientist. I can make scientific statements that are backed up by fact, and I would be untouchable. And actually, I think there has been a slight creep. So now I am being told that even just saying words like male and female is de facto transphobic.
Who's telling you that?
People on social media, people that write to my institute to ask that I be sacked, suspended.
Is that happening?
Yes, it is happening. And I've been, there was a case a while ago of a male athlete who identified as a woman and wanted to be in the female category. And off the back of that, this athlete's mother reported me to the police for a hate crime incident.
Wow.
And then told my institute that I was under investigation with the police for a hate crime incident. And my institute very kindly informed me of this. They said, we can't really do anything about this. This is happening, but you should, you deserve to know this. My institute have been really good.
Okay. They
have, as far as I can tell, checked my Twitter feed. I'm mostly active on Twitter. I don't use any other social media. But, I've published in reputable journals about this now. I think I'm polite. I don't think I pull punches, but I'm not trying to be deliberately provocative or enter into what might be a culture war. I've tried very clearly to stay quite calm.
Culture war seeks you out, though.
Well, and it does. I try not to get pulled into, talking about what someone looks like on a photo or what those kinds of things. It's not my personality, as well as it's not really what I'm.
Not only is it bullying, I think, to do that, to focus on the looks of an individual, but I think it plays into the myth on the other side, which is that if somebody passes well enough on the outside, it's almost like saying, oh, you look how ridiculous you look like a bloke, you can't possibly be a woman. Then if someone does look like a woman, and we know that's happened, do you remember that show Something About Miriam?
No, I don't.
That was
I don't watch much TV. Sorry.
It was like 20 years ago, 25,
Okay.
but it stayed in my brain because it was just scary for me as a child to watch, because it was this reality show on an island, one of these loved ones.
Oh, I do. I've
Yeah.
heard a synopsis of it, but sorry.
Oh my gosh. And they, there's like 10 guys have got to win over the woman. And it's this extremely beautiful looking woman. And they fight for her and they cry over her and all of this stuff. And right at the end, someone finally like wins her, whatever that means in these kinds of shows. And she reveals that she's a man and it's a guy. The contestants sued, I think successfully afterwards, because obviously they've been misled and it's not a very nice thing to do to someone. I mean, I don't know if it's essentially, would that be a version of sexual assault or rape? Or
Yeah, I don't know what you would call it,
Yeah.
but I think I remember thinking when I learned about this program, like I say, I haven't watched it, but that this is just outright exploitation of both parties,
Oh,
right?
horrible.
For the vultures out there who just want to be titillated by, oh look, that's a man who thinks he's a woman or whatever, they might say, and then the men who. In whatever level of seriousness it existed, thought that they were going there to, like you say, win a woman, and then finding out that they were kind of lied to about that.
Mm-hmm.
And actually that is important for people, that, they have kind of consent and non-deception when they're choosing partners or choosing who they want to go home with from a nightclub or whatever.
Absolutely.
So I think it does reveal something quite important. But again, just this idea that here is someone that is being exploited, this time deliberately, by a TV company, and who I think committed suicide.
I'm not sure, actually. I'll have to look into that.
I believe the person committed suicide.
A lot of people from reality shows did. This was the Wild West period of reality shows, wasn't
anything
it?
Goes kind of thing.
Oh, it was, yeah. I'll have to look that up. Obviously, it comes from Something About Mary. That was where the Something About Miriam came from. But I mean, the point being, this was somebody who passed well enough at being a woman. And so what does that mean? That they then are a woman? If we're going to use that argument of people who don't look like, who look bad, I just think it's a bad place to go. And I don't like that whole.
And it's so completely unnecessary in sport because, like I say, I support sex verification. I support screening. I support it early before we get this far. And so it's completely unnecessary to start engaging with how people look.
Yeah.
Because we just don't need to be operating on that personal level. We can kind of keep it de-individualized, private, and behind the scenes before the athlete gets out there for people to point and say, well, look, of course they're a man.
I guess one of the issues, if I want to give the benefit of the doubt to the other side, just to devil's advocate it, for people who do say, look what you look like kind of thing, more and more people that I speak to about the trans thing seem to say that so much of it is about it's looks and looking like a beautiful woman and being perceived as one, and photos taken, thousands of them, to get the right angle and say, look what I am. And those people might be very aggressive, say, to someone like Graham Linehan, who would then be like, come on, mate, so I can understand where that comes from as well. Can a trans person ever start to, and by the way, I just checked that Something About Miriam, she was found dead in 2019.
Okay.
So I think you've got that probably right, but without going on all the details, can a trans person approximate being a woman from the hormones and different changes and things?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we think about in sport, no. When you look at, and let's characterize or draw the kind of sketch of a 20-year-old, certainly post-puberty male who decides to drop their testosterone, probably take some estrogen and some female hormones as well, and perhaps look for surgical interventions, to create particular shapes. So can they approximate a woman as I walk past them in the street? Well, maybe I don't actually spend that much time analysing people in the street for what sex I think they are. I think humans are really good at it. It's called a ceiling talent. And interestingly, women are slightly better at it than men. We find it very easy, not just humans, all mammals. We find it very easy to, very quickly identify the sex of someone that we're interacting with. But I'm not that interested when I walk down the street how well someone passes. And nor am I particularly concerned if I think I've detected someone trying to pass but who doesn't quite. You know, this is none of my business. It's none of my business when I work with that person, you know, and they're on the desk next to me and we're working on it. It's absolutely none of my business at this point. It's none of my business when they serve me a pint in a pub. Okay, when it is my business, or when I think it is the business of, you know, women who have carved out certain spaces where it's not about how someone looks, it's about someone being male. It's about the fact of their male sex. In sport, that's very obviously about their body. In something like a rape crisis centre, a transgender woman who might pass with that quick glance down the street, but doesn't really when you're sitting in a counselling session with them, and perhaps when you're hearing them speak and seeing them move. There's lots of tales between males and females about how we move our bodies, right? How, you know, the pitch of our voice and shapes of our eyebrows and all those kinds of things. When you've got that kind of situation and a woman who thought she was in a female-only space and then actually detects that they've been allowing males in, and there is a male now in this group with her, that starts to become the business that I'm interested in. That's when sex matters. Doesn't matter for almost anything else. I'd rather it mattered less in a lot of those domains. I don't want to get paid less than a man, right? But the reality is I probably do. Over the course of my career earnings, I will get paid less than the equivalent male. I don't want my sex to matter when it comes to paying me. But undeniably, my sex does matter, because part of that sex gap is because I'm more likely to take time off work bringing up kids. Okay? So sex matters because I'm the sex that can get pregnant. What do we do about the pay gap that probably comes from that? That's for the policymakers at my university.
That's the next episode. We'll do that. What if one day they could? What if is that even a possibility? I'm just thinking in terms of like sci-fi, and if you could in the future, does it even make sense to say that it's a man who's I guess post or pre-puberty, but maybe there's different answers, or maybe does it even make sense? Because some people have said to me, like, no, every single cell in your body is female or male. That, you know, is there even a biological discussion to have of could they in 10,000 years say, you know, you want to be a woman, we'll do the thing, and that's how you can do it?
So I think there are a couple of things here. And as a developmental biologist, I probably have the answer, which is how I've applied that to sport. When you develop, some things are quite changeable. Okay. Some things you can reach adulthood and think, I don't really like that, or whatever. And you can row it back, if you like, or switch it across and start to, you know, if we give adults full kind of autonomy over what they want for their body and that kind of thing, I can imagine there are things that you can change quite effectively, but there are going to be lots of things that you can't ever fully reverse or can't ever completely conceal, if that's the right word to use. Is there a way that you could click a switch and turn someone's XY cells into XX? Okay, I could come up with a technology that does that, right? You could inject something and modify some genetics here and there. You know, I could kind of hypothesize in a sci-fi way that happening. But you're doing that at a point where they've already experienced a history of physical development.
Right.
And doing that switch, as hypothetical as it is, doesn't necessarily undo what's already been cemented as someone's physical form. And I also don't really think that would be necessary. Can't we just figure a way through this without evoking, you know, this kind of... Would a trans woman feel better about knowing that cells were suddenly XX? I don't know. But,
if that changed a few more things. I suppose if they did it pre-puberty as well. Not that I would suggest anyone do. I'm just thinking, before anyone starts screaming at me that they think this is what the world I want. Yeah. It's not. It's just I'm with a developmental biologist, and I don't often get to ask. This is like a late at night pub drinking session.
Yeah,
I wonder if it could
happen. Your science fiction hypothesis, I think, would also require a time machine.
Okay.
Because you need to unroll back to that point of fertilization, right? When you've got a sperm, you know, you've got an egg with an X in it. You've got a sperm that can either be the X or the Y, and you need to get that Y sperm back out and put an X sperm in, right?
I love the idea that in 10,000 years, someone will have recovered this video and your sounds like old fashioned.
Yeah.
Okay, little did she know there was a button behind the ear that if you push, you become a woman or a man becomes a man or something. I'd love the idea. I'd love to sort of do it for a few. And this is nothing to do with gender or trans or whatever. I want to experience everything in life. And it's sad to me that I can't know what it is to be a woman, but I've come to terms with that I will never know what it is to be a woman for a million different reasons. Not that, by the way, again, just in case
I think that's called healthy adjustment.
What do you mean? Understanding that I won't be a woman. Yeah. It's not a weird obsession I have. It's something I very rarely think about. But I can understand the desire to go. I mean, wouldn't you if you could push a button, you'd have a few days as a man just to.
It'd be amazing. It'd be fair. And this feeds into perhaps some of the more social aspects of that. If you ask women if they could do this, what would they do if they were a man for the day? And an awful lot of those women say, walk around without feeling unsafe, vulnerable. I'd go running at night. These very simple answers that sometimes it's quite something that men take for granted because they've never had to perhaps think about the fact that 10 o'clock at night running through a park is not a safety issue for them. I used to run and I would pick my routes very carefully and the times of day that I would go very carefully. If I was a man, I wouldn't have to do that. I used to get jealous of watching men run when it was cooler, right? When it was 10 o'clock at night, because that's just simply not available. So yes, I think most women would say, and I'd understand a man saying, oh yeah, I would be a woman for the day, but I think that would
different
benefit
reasons.
One group more than the other.
The only thing I say to that, and I've sort of said this to my wife, is that I do agree with what you're saying, that it is much, 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 much more dangerous for women to do those kinds of things. But I just want to make it clear, like many men anyway, are also a bit scared many are not as well.
No, reasonable.
But I'm scared to go down a dark alley at night. I'm scared I wouldn't go running in certain places at night as well. But I totally understand these are different levels. I'm just easily scared, I think.
I have just thought you could probably try cloning someone and
It wouldn't be
changing their
me.
sex, but it wouldn't be you, yeah.
But that's interesting still. I know, because I suppose twins, when there's a
Again,
boy,
this is sci-fi. Well,
well, twins that are boy and girl, do they have the same gene?
No, they're derived from different, usually derived from different embryos. So they'll have a whole host of other genetic variations between them as well.
Okay, so it's
But there is a kind of hypothetical that I've used before if we think about identical twins, one of each sex, and I can come up with some really what would be very freakish genetic events that could lead to that. And then that would be interesting. Well, which one can run faster, right? Because then you've effectively controlled for all of those other types of genetics apart from the sex ones.
That would be fascinating. Also, just to be able to look at, say, oh, that's my sister. That's exactly what I would look and be like if I were a girl.
Assuming you were brought up in the same environment. And
oh, gosh.
same diseases and same nutrition as well. Those kinds of things feed into how we look as adults.
Of course. I've got one more question for you, but first tell me, where can people follow you, follow your work and stuff?
So I am a trustee of a charity called Sex Matters. Mm-hmm. And we're a collective of people, mostly women, but not necessarily so. And we are looking at how within UK law, where sex needs to mean sex. And by that we mean where females have the right to, protections for various reasons. So I can be found there, and I work very closely with some people on sports there, and we've got some sports pages and those kinds of things. But I am most active on Twitter, and my handle is @fondofbeatles. Yes. And I say penis a lot on there.
Oh, well, that's great. That's why. What better reason to follow your ex account? Who is a heretic you admire?
I think I admire most of the heretics around me at Sex Matters. So the people who have been speaking out early, who saw the damage that some of this ideology, that gender identity can have. I would count myself as one of those, but in sport, which is a fairly narrow focus, I think that the people like Helen Joyce and Maya Forstater, who are, suffering discrimination at work, who have done huge amounts of research into the wider domain of this. I obviously admire J.K. Rowling for sticking her neck out so heavily. Yeah. And in that sense, protecting an awful lot of us that didn't really have that that defense. I'm seeing more and more people that I admire for various reasons catch up. And I don't, I'm not one to rub anyone's face in it. People get there eventually, I think, when you ask them to start to unpick. And people like Richard Dawkins, who is, seems to have understood, well, this is happening, and actually this doesn't really fit with what I know scientifically. So I'm pleased now that I see some big scientific names starting to say, what's this thing about sex being a spectrum? This is just,
Not Neil deGrasse Tyson, though.
No, he very much favours, I think, that sport should be separated by gender identity, which tells us that he, puts some significance on gender identity as a means of moving through the world.
Well, this is also a man who's been accused of certain things.
Yes.
That I don't want to go, just in case I get it wrong and get sued, but there are accusations. He's responded to those accusations and things and admitted wrongdoing in them. So there you go. Make of that what you will, everyone. People, please go and follow Emma on Twitter. It's Fond of Beatles. She's one of the best people to follow on there. Check out Sex Matters as well. Please keep watching his channel. Hit the like button. I've said about 7 things, but just do all the things. Watch this. There's an episode where my finger is, and watch that, please.